Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
Listen to Pavarotti.
Can I be your superhero?
So number one, I don't feel like IGG should have ever been done in this case. IGG is something you do at the end of a case when your case has gone cold and you've ran out all of your leads. And if you look at the DOJ interim policy, it states that very clearly in Section 5, before an agency takes on IGG, you're supposed to eliminate all investigative leads. Bryan Kohberger's name was in a report and was the most viable investigative lead in this case before the IGG results were done. So I want to start this conversation with IGG wasn't required. That's not the only way to get to Bryan Kohberger in this case. And I think that's really important for the people to say, I'll never believe Bryan Kohberger did this case. He was already on the radar. And I think they would have got to him. And man, if they would have got to him that way, this entire case changes. I think it gets much cleaner. But the decision was made to go down IGG. The problem is when the IGG did not produce the initial results that they were hoping for, there was a decision made to go even further outside of those guardrails. And this is where Othram was told to stop work. The FBI took over. There's some things that happened with that sample. And in my opinion, this is where law enforcement needs to be held accountable. And I'm saying that as a law enforcement officer for 20 years and someone who's helped law enforcement for the last 15 years and currently today.
Here's what we now know, and I feel like it's a perfect time to share this video on the IGG. Good morning, members. At this point, I'm not sure how my little puny brain is even doing all this. When all I'm really doing is taking the information that's now provided to us, but I can't believe I'm even able to do this, to be honest with you, because we've covered so much in this case. But this is what we have now that I have created for us because of the newly released documents. And it's quite interesting, I think. And I'm just one step closer to proving my theory on the crime scene sample on the DNA on the knife sheath going to the factory worker at the K-Bar plant. But here's how we're getting closer to this. Let me try to explain this. We now know that these two individuals are Bryan Kohberger's third great-grandparents, right? Second great-grandparents of Bryan Kohberger's father, Michael. We now know that nothing in the family tree comes back to Bryan Kohberger's mother. So you can take Bryan Kohberger's mother, put to the side, completely out of the family tree on the IGG stuff. It's only Kohberger's father, and we know that now because of the released court docs, and I'll show you that here in a minute. But we also know that Kohberger's third great-grandparents are a guy named Clark and a lady named Burke. We've even got their names, Clark and Burke. Right? So Clark and Burke are Kohberger's third great-grandparents, second great-grandparents of his father, Michael. And as you go through this lineage here, it starts with, I'm just going to do it from Michael, second great-grandparent, Clark and Burke, to great-grandparent, which was their children, to grandparent, to parents, to Michael Kohberger, and then finally to Bryan Kohberger far down the line. And we know now unequivocally that Clark and Burke had 8 children. Of their 8 children, 2 lines are of note. One is their child named Tyler. Tyler is the family tree that Othram Labs chose to go down. And it led them all the way to the initials RK and HS. And below them is their children, which were the 4 brothers that the Othram Lab IGG search led to. We now know that on the other end of these 8 children is a lady named Agnes. Agnes is Bryan Kohberger's great-great-grandmother. great-grandparent. Michael Koberger's great-grandparent, Brian's great-great-grandmother, name's Agnes, and that's where this line comes in. And we know that when Othram got to the four brothers, and they weren't Koberger, the FBI took Othram's DNA sample and did a bunch of hidden stuff with it, which we now know what they did and the dates they did it. This is kind of crazy. But by doing that, they found likely Brian's either first or second cousin, and that person's initial is JS, which is crazy. Now, I don't think this is going to be Jack Showalter. Could it be Jackson Schneider? I mean, good grief. I know I let that lady Phoenix tell me Jackson Schneider was a young kid that was in high school in up in Hoquiam. And I never did follow up after that, just believed her that Jackson Schneider wasn't the student at the University of Idaho. But if I find out that I was right and she lied, I will be so mad because I would have solved this thing over a year ago. But I'll have to look into that just to see. I can't stand when we have people that come out here and make up stories. I mean, just messes you up. But anyway, this JS was likely a first or a second cousin of Koberger, and then another person named AV was another possible second, maybe third cousin of Koberger. And when the FBI used that updated profile to locate this JS and uploaded it back into the system, along with information from AV, it gave the FBI the grandparent of Michael Koberger. Now, from there, they just take the family tree out, and whoever's in that family tree, they cross-reference for who was in Idaho at the time, and they get their suspect. That's why they say you can't say the IGG leads to a specific person. It leads to a group of people, and then other investigation leads to a tip, which leads the people back home to supposedly do more investigating to find, a real DNA match. And I'll explain how that could have been manipulated, not even manipulated. I'll explain how that could just happen organically and it not be Koberger, who is the person whose DNA was on the knife sheath. But in the end, this is how they get to Koberger's great grandparents, the family tree of everybody in there. And then they cross-reference whoever's in that tree with who was in Idaho at the time, and they get their tip. That's like the factual breakdown. I mean, people wonder how they got to Koberger. I mean, this is literally how they did it. What I believe is they did it in error, though, because they were searching for the DNA on the knife sheath that belonged to the factory worker. Let me explain further. In the new release court docs, we have Leah Larkin, PhD, January 22nd, 2025. One of the things that she points out right up front is something that I think is going to go a long way in us proving our theory of the factory worker. And that is this thing called endogamy. Endogamy is genetic genealogy at ATDNA. Can be difficult to analyze in endogamous groups because individuals are often related several times over and share more DNA than might be expected based on the closest relationship. The amount of endogamy varies by group, as does the impact it has on DNA matching. Some common endogamous groups in the U.S. are the Ashkenazi Jews, Hispanics, Cajuns, and Italians. So what is endogamy? Endogamy is when you have a ethnic group that's in a certain area, they kind of stick to their own, like Italians like to marry Italians. So what happens is when you go down a family tree, you have people that really don't even know that they're related. It could be second or third cousins marrying each other and doing this quite often because they want to stay within their lineage for quite a while. By doing this, it actually makes their DNA markers much more common across their relatives than, say, a typical group randomly selected to the general population. Let me explain how that'll really impact this further here in just a little bit. But now we've got this information from Larkin. They didn't redact it, which is kind of crazy to me. So Larkin says, my role, I was engaged by Mr. Kohberger's legal defense team on the 27th of July, 2023, to provide my expert opinion on the FGG performed in this case. Now, my ability to do that has been hampered by an ongoing lack of disclosure regarding these materials. Obtaining the underlying FGG documents via discovery has been an extremely involved and drawn-out process. While some of the requested documents have been produced, many others either have not been provided at all, or the defense has been prohibited by court order from using them to full effect. So they didn't want them to have it. And even though Othram was under instruction to preserve the whole genome profile that you have generated on this case, any remaining DNA extract, if existing, any data generated on this case, and any other records they have on this case, and anything else laid out in the state contract with Idaho, that work has never been shared with the defense. So certainly didn't give their remaining DNA extract over to the defense, as well as any of the other records. The FBI didn't preserve its work in a way that allows us to evaluate it. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The prosecution produced 2 S&P profiles, right? We've already heard about this. One labeled the Othram profile and one labeled the FBI S&P profile. And Othram advertises forensic grade genome sequencing, but based on the size of their data file, they may have done a microarray rather than a whole genome sequence. I'm going to have to really dive in and see the difference between microarray and whole genome sequence, but the fact that they said they may have, I haven't done that yet. But without access to the original data, the defense cannot adequately evaluate the scientific work. But the FBI file is more than twice the size of the Othram one. So presumably they used bioinformatics to create new information. Without access to the original data, the defense cannot adequately evaluate the scientific work. But they say presumably the reason the Othram profile goes from this size and the FBI's file is this size is because the FBI took Othram's profile, used bioinformatics, which created a profile that was twice the size. The problem with that is the use of bioinformatics, when coupled with endogamy, creates some really big issues, as we're going to find out. Remember, endogamy is the intermixing of a particular ethnic group like Italians. So as we go through this, it goes on to say that Othram was contracted to produce a S&P profile from the crime scene sample, uploaded it to approved genealogy databases to perform the genealogical research. They uploaded the crime scene profile to Family Tree DNA, GeoDmatch Pro, the 2 main databases that allow forensic genetic genealogy searches, the FGGS, on or before the 8th of December, 2022. I have no reason to believe Othram did not follow appropriate protocols to access these 2 databases. Othram was ordered to cease work on the case on the 10th of December, and they prepared a preliminary report 6 days later. So their report came out on December 16th. They likely uploaded everything on the 8th and was asked to stop work on the 10th. Based on that report, the most informative matches were RK, sharing 70.7 centimorgans with the crime scene sample, and HS, sharing 60 centimorgans. Othram described them as low matches. Here's where it gets interesting. Here's how I was able to create that family tree so far. RK and HS are third cousins to one another and share a set of second great grandparents, Clark Lewis Tyler, born in 1842, and Ellen Burke, born in 1847. This is how I was able to get the second great grandparents' name of Michael Kohberger's second great grandparents. It was Tyler and Burke. They were also the second great grandparents of this RK and HS. The most likely possibilities were that the unknown subject was descended from one of the 8 children of the Tyler Burke marriage, or from a sibling of either Clark Tyler or Ellen Burke. But that's how I was able to get the Tyler Burkes, had 8 children, and the line that Othram followed, which led to RK and HS, and later the line that led to Kohberger. Because it says Othram recommended testing a descendant of another Tyler Burke child. That step could have taken weeks or months and would not have led directly to Brian Kohberger, because he is descended from a different sibling altogether. So when we look at this, they've got this line here from Clark and Burke, and it's the Tyler line that goes down to RK and HS. And I believe this is the line that finally ended up to the 4 brothers. And they had a centimorgan match of, I believe it said like 40 and 50. So they knew this was the wrong line, but they took them because they were third cousins, and they worked their way back up to Tyler and up to Clark and Burke as the second great grandparents. Now they knew that they had 8 children. What they recommended was getting a child that was out of one of these 6 in the middle here to enter their information in so that they could get closer to the match. What Larkin says, though, was this one wasn't the line that led to Kohberger. The one that they recommended getting a child from was not the line that led to Brian Kohberger. Brian Kohberger's line was over here, and it's Agnes. So I hope that's not clear as mud. But they said that Kohberger was descended from a different sibling altogether. I'll show you how I get to Agnes here in a minute. The FBI's Los Angeles team began building family trees on the 13th of December. We actually got another date. And had named Brian Kohberger as a suspect by December 19th. In my opinion, the FBI identified Mr. Kohberger in just 6 days because they violated the Department of Justice policy and they uploaded a modified DNA profile under a fictitious name. Now, the modified DNA profile they uploaded under a fictitious name, as I'm going to show you, is that JS. Basically, what they did, and it'll kind of tell you all this in here. Here's how they came to the conclusion, right? The S&P profiles were provided by the discovery materials, one labeled Othram profile, one labeled FBI SNP profile. They are not the same, and the defense does not have access to protocols. The Othram profile, 637 SNPs. The FBI contains 1.5 million SNPs. Othram uploaded their file on or before the 8th of December, and because the file was already in the database allowed by the DOJ policy, there was no need for a second DNA data file. So, although there was no need for a second DNA data file, the FBI appears to have modified Othram's file using bioinformatics, more than doubling its size, presumably so this manipulated file could be uploaded to the same or other databases. No information was provided how the other 900,000 SNPs were created. But here's how this thing works. So that was the Kohberger profile that they used informatics, or not Kohberger, the crime scene profile that they used informatics to increase its size to either hide their use of the database or enter it into the same database. But then it says an email dated the 14th of December between a redacted sender and a recipient shows a match of 91 centimorgans between a user with the alias SC and the crime scene profile. Othram would have reported a 70 centimorgan match. When I said JS up here, I was wrong. It's actually this SC that they found and uploaded. Okay, so when they reviewed the discovery on the 4th, SC was opted out. So basically, to make a long story short, the FBI looked through the databases that they weren't supposed to look through and found this SC that was more of a Centimorgan match than the other ones that Othram was working with. And they took their information, created a profile that was similar to SC, and uploaded that to the other database so that they could get the information, which was very underhanded. But anyway, none of that means anything about going to Kohberger. Okay, so the GED match shows how many days the kid, and she goes through and explains how they manipulated that. But once they did manipulate that, the FBI found 2 key matches that Othram did not find. This is where you get to JS, 250 Centimorgan match, and AV, 107 Centimorgan match. Now, by going through the table, JS is going to be likely either a first or second cousin of Kohberger. AV is going to be probably a third or fourth cousin. So it's interesting. And I don't know if they're going to be like on cousins on like his age level or maybe his father's cousins, because they were uploading their information into GED match. So you imagine they're probably not that old. But anyway, that's just me guessing. So again, Othram sees these matches. They would have included them in their preliminary report rather than focusing on more distant matches and recommending a prolonged strategy to advance the case. So what they did was they found these 2. They know that they're closer to the crime scene sample in the form of second or third cousins. So they used those to find the common ancestor, which is the line that led to Bryan Kohberger. All right, so as you go down, you'll see the analysis in this case. As noted above, the 2 DNA matches that Othram reported, RK and HS, led to the Clark Lewis Tyler and his wife Ellen Burke. They were the second grandparents of RK and HS and the third great-grandparents of Bryan Kohberger. Okay? That's how I got that on the chart. They potentially have hundreds of living descendants who would match RK and HS at 70.7 and 60 respectively. A third match at 36 is the first cousin of RK. A single DNA match, JS, helped narrow the search to Mr. Kohberger's great-grandparents. So JS was most likely found in the MyHeritage database, which they're not supposed to go into. It's the Israeli database that strictly prohibits that. But by going in there and finding JS and AV, that's what gave them the ability to find the shared great-grandparent of Bryan Kohberger, or the grandparent of Michael Kohberger. So that's how they got to this line. But once you get to grandparent, it can be how many children do they have? How many children do they have? How many children do they have? It is still a big pull from here. The only way to determine that this pool is a lead, again, is just to take everybody in it from that pool. You're not going to get closer Centimorgans after that. They're just finding the great-grandparent. You're going to take everybody in that pool, identify them as who was in the area, and then say that's your tip. So how did I get to Agnes? I can't remember. It was in here. Okay, so other DNA match. What other DNA match was used to focus on the search of Mr. Kohberger's grandparents? AV was reported to share 107 centimorgans with the forensic sample. See, it says not Kohberger, but it says forensic sample. I believe AV tested also at MyHeritage for reasons described above. I have 2 other concerns about this match. First, AV is of Italian descent. Many Italians are from endogamous regions. Endogamy can cause matches to share more DNA than expected on the closest relationship. Second, in my experience, the matching algorithm at MyHeritage often inflates matches, reporting more shared DNA than other databases of the same 2 individuals. In other words, it's possible that AV shares 107 centimorgans with the forensic sample, not because there is a direct relationship, but because they have multiple distant ancestors from the same region in Italy because of MyHeritage algorithm, or both. One way to evaluate whether endogamous matches are related within the time frame proposed is to consider not just the total amount of shared DNA, but also the number of shared DNA segments and the size of the longest segment. We never got to see the electrophenogram of Q1.1 to even be able to compare those. Although this information was requested in defendant's fifth motion to compel discovery, it was not provided. No matches to the forensic sample were related through Brian Kohberger's mother. So that's why I say you can take Kohberger's mom out of it. In other words, even if the matches to JS and AV were obtained legitimately, even if the match to AV was not affected by endogamy, the FGG search did not identify Mr. Kohberger. Several other men in the extended Kohberger family fit those DNA matches. The IGG never went to Kohberger. It went to several other men in the extended Kohberger family. I'm willing to bet if you could get a hold of those names, one of those men in the extended Kohberger family probably works at the dadgum K-Bar factory. And here's where endogamy really comes into play and how it could actually explain everything in this. So I'm going through and I'm making sure that my Grok does not use any cases, right? Any cases, not using any known case, and based strictly on the science. Analyze this scenario. IGG is performed on a case in Idaho. The DNA is found on a brand new knife sheath and is designated as touch DNA. The IGG search identifies a family tree in North Pennsylvania that starts within 100 miles, the family tree starts within 100 miles of the factory that produced, handled, and shipped the new knife sheath without using gloves at the factory is verified. Could the IGG lead to the wrong person in that tree with a statistical match if the search DNA was actually from a factory worker? Take into consideration the Italian lineage of the tree that was searched. And then it tells me it's scientifically plausible and all this kind of stuff. But then I dive in just a little bit deeper. I said, all right, with endogamy in mind in this scenario and the wrong person selected, in the highest scenario of matching alleles, what is likely the most matches a STR test would have? And it goes on to say the highest plausible scenario, maximum matching alleles for a wrong person selected due to endogamy in this Italian lineage family tree. A standard forensic STR test would most likely show matches at 15 to 20 plus loci out of the typical 20 to 24 in modern multiplex kits like PowerPlex Fusion or Global Filler, but not a full perfect match across all loci. But still 15 to 20 seems pretty dang high when you're looking at 24. If you start learning about how the loci work, they used to use 13. So highest scenario breakdown, likely maximum 18 to 22 matching alleles. So I said, if there were 22 matching alleles and the lab set the parameters of STR mix to the 22 setting, what would the RMP statistic likely be? And it goes through and tells you it would be a very high statistic. I said, would a statistic in this scenario reach as high as 1 in 5.37 octillion compared to the general population? Yes, a statistic of 1 in 537 octillion is plausible and realistic for a high quality 22 allele near full STR match in the general population, even in this endogamy scenario with STR mix. So if you take into account the highest probability of alleles matching due to endogamy, And then you transfer that to the test from the ISP on the crime scene sample because of the matching alleles from Kohberger to the crime scene sample. If that was his relative at the factory, they can adjust the settings, which we know they did in STR Mix. They adjusted the settings down and ran it in a 5-second run. And it would absolutely, according to Grok, produce a statistic like they did. Now, the second part to this mess is how the FBI doubled the size of the profile. The term that Leah Larkin used was bioinformatics. And that's how she believed they did it. And what bioinformatics is, an interdisciplinary field that combines biology, computer science, statistics, mathematics, and data engineering to acquire, store, analyze, interpret large, complex biological data sets, especially genomic data. And it goes through and it talks about how they interpret with algorithms things that aren't actually there, and basically guesses on things, right? And relevance to my scenario, touch DNA plus IgG plus endogamy. Standard forensic SDR testing, the 22 allele discussion, is low resolution compared to SNP arrays, which can have 500,000 to 1 million markers. Bioinformatics enables the shift to SNP based IgG, which is far more powerful for distant relative matching, but is heavily affected by endogamy. Bioinformatics is the essential computational engine that turns raw SNP data into actionable insights like ancestry, relatedness, and match probabilities. It dramatically increases resolution and accuracy, but also introduces complexity in endogamous populations, where it must carefully model elevated DNA sharing to avoid false leads. Well, I don't think they did that in this case, and they certainly didn't produce the discovery to prove they didn't do it. So let me know your thoughts on this, folks. Y'all have a great day.